It was the promotion that took the concept of hardcore wrestling and turned it up to 11. More violence, more sex, more controversy. It would be this mission to offend that would lead to its owner's arrest and prove to be its downfall. By popular demand, this is Defunct Championship Wrestling, Episode 5, the original run of XPW. Now you may be wondering why XPW is this episode's subject if they're still running. Well, it's simple. They were originally closed longer than they were in operation. And people seem to want a retrospective take on it. So here we are. Today we're going to take a look back at its history, but leave the more salacious stories to the folks with the budget and the lawyers. If you're watching this, then you've seen the Dark Side of the Ring episode. If you haven't, go watch that for the really juicy stuff. Let's go! XPW was founded in the summer of 1999 by adult film producer Rob Black in California. Black and his company Xtreme Associates were infamous in that world for releasing some of the most risque and some would say deviant films on the market at the time. Black was also a big wrestling fan. He frequented ECW and WWF shows back when he lived on the East Coast and had even become friendly with some ECW stars. Black continued to attend WWF and WCW shows after moving to Los Angeles, where he first encountered California's independent scene. While exiting a show back in 1998, Black was handed a flyer for a local promotion, Southern California Championship Wrestling. These small shows were put on by a group of 20-somethings, including our friend from Extreme Rising, Kevin Kleinrock, while he was still in college. Rob and the group hit it off. He had tons of ideas and lots of money to bring them to life, but didn't really know anything about the local indie scene. The SCCW guys, however, did. They had to choose between continuing to put on their tiny shows or joining up with Rob Black and whatever the hell it was he was going to do. The choice was obvious. They decided to team up with Rob Black. At first, Black wasn't sure what he'd do. Does he invest in a company? Maybe he'd start his own. He was a big ECW fan. Maybe he could do something like that. Call it XPW. But the X wouldn't stand for anything. He didn't want to risk stepping on Heyman's toes. It'd just be an X, it wouldn't stand for Xtreme or anything like that. In early 1999, Black decided to talk to Paul Heyman to convince Paul to allow him and his team to promote ECW on the West Coast. Paul was receptive to the idea as he was looking to expand but didn't have the funds or the infrastructure to do so. Wheels began to turn for Rob Black and co. to promote ECW in California. However, after ECW got their TNN deal, Heyman turned down the offer and disavowed any relationship with Black. Being associated with someone with Rob Black's reputation could look pretty poorly upon the already controversial ECW with its new network partner. Rob felt incredibly slighted and disrespected. So, Black decided to hell with Heyman. He would in fact start his own hardcore wrestling promotion.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna go build my own
wrestling company
with blackjack and hookers. In fact, forget the
wrestling.
And they were going to go full pelt, throw everything they could at it and stick it to Paul and ECW. Oh, and the X? Yeah, it stood for Xtreme now. In July 1999, XPW ran their first event. And over the next several months, Black compiled a roster of West Coast talent mostly trained by Vern Langdon, looking for an opportunity, like Angel, Homeless Jimmy, and of course Kid Chaos and his Uncle Supreme. He'd also bring in former ECW stars Big Dick Dudley and the Pitbulls. And because why not, let's bring in a bunch of adult film actresses too. Several women from the Xtreme Associates roster would be used as valets and other characters in the company, including Rob's wife Lizzie Borden. Black and XPW created a product that went much further than ECW. By '99, ECW had started to tone down its violence a little bit. Still not family entertainment compared to the big two, Paul certainly wasn't doing Taipei death matches anymore. XPW, however, turned up the dial on the sex and violence. XPW allowed a level of violence and risky stunts that even die-hard ECW fans would shake their heads at. I mean, just look at the New Jack and Vic Grimes incident, for example. Looking at this in the context of the time, it wasn't necessarily out of place in late 90s entertainment landscape. Howard Stern was the king of all media with his weekday radio show and its late-night airings on the E! Network really pushing the boundaries of good taste. UFC wasn't the pay-per-view monster it would become, but it was coming into its own and had national attention. Primetime television on both network and cable showed excessive amounts of violence and sex almost nightly. And WWF's Attitude Era was in full swing. Was XPW really that out of place in 1999 America? I don't think so. Over its first couple of years, XPW established its identity as the place for hardcore wrestling on the West Coast. But they also really leaned into the soap opera aspects of professional wrestling. Storylines involving betrayal, infidelity, kidnapping, torture, and even a resurrection. That's coming up. In 2000, XPW added even more big names to their roster. Stars like Chris Candido, Axl Rotten, The Public Enemy, and even Terry Funk made shots for the company. They even tried to bring in Onita for an exploding barbed wire death match against Sabu, but the state of California wouldn't allow it. They also continued to spotlight homegrown talent, like Johnny Webb, Pogo the Clown, yup, a literal wrestling version of John Wayne Gacy's clown alter ego, and the Messiah, the savior of hardcore. Messiah quickly became the main focus of XPW storylines at one point. He had a long story arc that ended with him, of course, being resurrected. His relationship with XPW and Rob would end in dramatic fashion. But maybe no one benefited more from XPW in this time period than Sabu. After leaving ECW for the final time in early 2000, Sabu wasn't getting much work. Things already hadn't worked out in WCW, ECW was a burnt bridge, and WWF weren't as interested as they had been in the mid-90s. XPW allowed Sabu to put himself back on the map. He'd be booked throughout Mexico, Canada, and even a tour of all Japan in the second half of 2000. I'm not saying XPW was solely responsible, but what I am saying is after XPW, Sabu went from being booked once or twice a month to being booked every week somewhere, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. By the summer of 2000, XPW was on its way to being the undisputed top independent promotion in California, but still needed to make some more noise. So when ECW announced that their Heatwave pay-per-view was coming to LA at the Grand Olympic Auditorium, a building XPW had made their home, Rob Black saw an opportunity to make that noise. It's been discussed to death, but essentially, weeks before the pay-per-view, rumor was that XPW would show up. So, ECW enlisted the help of former XPW star and porn actress, another old friend of ours, Jasmine St. Clair, to help locate the XPW contingent as fans began to enter the building. The posse of Messiah, Supreme, Homeless Jimmy, Kid Chaos, announcer Chris Kloss, and valet porn star Christy Mist sat ringside on the hardcam side. They couldn't be seen on camera, but security were still instructed to make sure any shirts were turned inside out and signs were confiscated. They were well behaved most of the night, but things escalated throughout the second half of the show, with them finally being kicked out after an altercation with Tommy Dreamer during the main event. Once the ECW wrestlers found out the XPW ring crew were putting out flyers for the next XPW show in the parking lot, they raced out there and a fight broke out. The XPW guys were outnumbered and took off. Rob Black went on the XPW TV show and claimed innocence to starting any altercations, and that XPW would outlive ECW. Come 2001, he'd be proven right. After WCW and ECW closed, XPW were able to load up some more. Juventud Guerrera, The Sandman, Vampiro, New Jack, and Shane Douglas all came in and gave XPW even more credibility. They'd also welcomed some non-hardcore centric talent that would become major players in California later on, like Excalibur and the roster they created led to pretty successful shows. They ran events in Los Angeles, Ventura, Bakersfield, and Reseda, California. The wrestling itself was about on par with similar promotions. Some really bad, some really good, most of it being somewhere in the middle. We can't fail to mention that the two worlds Rob Black controlled interacted more than just in ring. It was very common for XPW wrestlers to sometimes stumble across one of Rob's films in production. A wrestler would be getting ready to shoot a promo next to some guy getting fluffed for his next scene. walking past women engaged in unspeakable acts together, and even Dave Marquez editing Black's movies so he could work on producing the wrestling. It was an interesting work environment to say the least. To his credit, Rob Black had done what he set out to do to this point. He created a hardcore competitor to ECW, outlasted Paul Heyman, and established the West Coast as a force on the US independent scene. Then came 2002. With ECW closed, Rob and XPW saw a massive opportunity for someone to take over the indie scene in Philadelphia. Rob thought he should be that someone. Black was still obsessed with sticking it to Heyman, ECW, and maybe even the East Coast as a whole. So, in July of 2002, XPW ran their last California show for 8 months. And in August, they would debut in the famed Viking Hall on Swanson and Rittner Street with Hostile Takeover. And that was a pretty fair description of what XPW did with their Philly move. As mentioned in episode 3 of this series looking at Propane Pro Wrestling, not only did XPW start holding events at the arena, but they were the only ones able to hold wrestling there. They've been able to get exclusive rights to the building, kicking out both 3PW and Combat Zone Wrestling. XPW's time in Philly was contentious from the beginning. Supposedly, Rob Black had told people that Rob Feinstein of RF Video and ROH helped him get a license in Pennsylvania. RF disputed the claim, stating he refused to allow them to put him down as a reference. Black tried to pay off wrestlers to sabotage CZW, 3PW, and ROH by no-showing. XPW allegedly called every ROH wrestler to no-show an event in September. Only Boogaloo would follow through and no-show. Eventually though, Joey Matthews, Josh Prohibition, and M-Dog20 all came into XPW. They'd also try to sabotage a 3PW show by getting X-Pac, Dusty Rhodes, and Sabu to no-show, but that didn't work either. Early on, XPW drew great large crowds to the arena, but over time, fans grew tired of all the shenanigans and houses started declining every month. Someone even spray-painted XPW sucks on the side of the arena. XPW during this time also toned down the violence of their shows, presenting more straight-up wrestling with some hardcore elements instead of hardcore with elements of wrestling. Ultimately, they ran 7 Philly shows between 2002 and 2003 before moving back out to California for a few months. XPW would run 2 more shows in California in February and March. Also in March, they tried to reboot a bit in Pittsburgh with Shane Douglas as the booker. Their turnout was pretty good. Shane put a lot of work into promoting the event, but this would be the final XPW show for its original run. In April of 2003, XPW's parent company, Xtreme Associates, would have their offices raided by postal inspectors and other federal authorities. Everything pertaining to their business dealings were seized. In August, Rob Black and Lizzie Borden were indicted on 10 counts of the production and distribution by mail and the internet of obscene materials. The investigation all seemed to stem from a PBS documentary in February of 2002 called American Porn, where Rob Black appeared and stated,
"We've got tons of stuff that they technically could arrest us for. I mean, we do."
The arrest put an end to XPW. In March 2009, after years of appeals, Rob and Lizzie each pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to distribute obscene materials. In July of 2009, they were both sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison. In a hilarious error, instead of going straight to the minimum security prison, Rob mistakenly reported to the main facility, where he was placed in solitary confinement for a month because it was the only space they had available. Rob later clarified that he was actually placed in solitary because he was mistakenly designated as a sex offender. Extreme Pro Wrestling accomplished most of its goals in its brief existence. But as a vanity project that was created as an FU to ECW, it could only go so far. Black was obsessed with Paul Heyman. I mean, look at him trying to imitate those ECW Heyman promos. He had a disdain for doing anything considered traditional, safe, or inoffensive. They once did an entire angle around Rob Black's kayfabe stroke. This, and of course challenging the feds, were all contributing factors to killing XPW. But it wasn't all bad. Their shows had some pretty good wrestling, some really memorable characters. They made stars out of talents like Supreme, Damian Steele, and Dynamite D, and they even had a TV show locally in LA and then in Philly that aired 134 episodes between 2000 and 2003. Big Vision Entertainment would go on to host 2 XPW reunion shows, Cold Day in Hell in May of 2008 and XPW X in August 2009, to celebrate its 10th anniversary. Big Vision also released a Season 1 DVD set of XPW TV to coincide with the first reunion show. The set sold about 4,500 units in its initial run, which isn't bad considering XPW's original exposure. In 2021, XPW was featured on Dark Side of the Ring, which exposed all of its seedy and alleged criminal behavior. Later that year, based on the newfound attention, Rob Black decided to relaunch XPW. I haven't watched anything besides some clips online, but it seems to be going fine. It seems to be going fine. All jokes aside, XPW's back and people seem to enjoy it. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but that's the beauty of wrestling. It's a subjective art form, but something for everyone. And that's the story of XPW. Were you ever an XPW fan? Let me know your favorite moments and matches in the comments, along with any other defunct promotions I should cover in the future. I think I want to stay away from the Philly scene for a while though. I'm Scott from WrestleSpective. Thanks for watching.